Here's a Sony model TC-105A reel-to-reel portable, tape recorder portable. Somewhat of a misnomer. It's weighs about 28 pounds, solid state, and finally decided to pull it out of my collection storage and see if I can get this guy to do something. But right now I do know that it does have problems, and of course it's old. It's 1960s. Capstan does not engage, and the take up and feed platters are very stiff. So we're going to have to take this guy apart and see if we can clean up some of the lubrication and see if we can get it operational again. Well, getting the recorder out of its housing wasn't too much trouble. It was only about 4 tie points, and the chassis does come out of the base housing without too much trouble. The first thing I did was I took and lubricated the platters, reel platters. That's real easy to do. There's just 2 screws. Platter comes off, clean the bearing, relubricate that, and those came right back up. The capstan and flywheel turn fine without any trouble. And before I even powered it up, I used my lamp series tester to make sure there was no major AC shorts, and there wasn't. It worked out relatively well. That's a good test set. You put a lamp in series with the old electronics, and if there's any shorts, it just draws enough current to light the lamp, and that's about it. Now the big problem is trying to figure out the mechanics. And oh, the amplifier, audio amplifier, seems to come up with no trouble. The big deal now is trying to figure out how the mechanics work for the pinch roller, which is retracted and put into place against the capstan during play and record. It's kind of a complicated mechanism. I still have to work on what the deal is with that. Yeah, this guy is really turning into being a real project. I had to take the whole flywheel assembly apart to get underneath this assembly, which lowers and raises the pinch roller. And there's like 3 pivot points where the lubrication has failed, and I'm going to have to redo that. But that was a real challenge, removing this head assembly. Of course, the heads are on the other side now after I turn this upside down. And of course, had to take the flywheel out. So far it's been quite a mechanical disassembly. The real trick now is to take some good pictures of this assembly, because I'm going to have to disassemble this a little further, relubricate the pivot points here. You know, one amazing thing too is once I did some of the disassembly, is I did have to take the flywheel out, and that's going to have to be the bearing cleaned and lubricated. But the flywheel in this thing is really husky. That's got to be at least 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds of flywheel. That's really impressive. This thing is really beefy. Further inspection has shown that this mechanism is really bound up. There's a spring. Actually, the way this is supposed to work is this mechanism goes back and forth with the function lever, of course, and that pushes and retracts the pinch roller, and this is extremely bound up. There's a spring here that's supposed to pull this back, retract this, but it is really bound up right now. There's actually only 2 bearing points. Appears to be this one here and this one here are the only 2 bearing points that move. This, of course, is the capstan bearing here. So we're going to lubricate these two main points that appear to be the only bearing points. Maybe this one too, but these seem to be the two main bearing points. We've also drawn a small picture of the mechanism, and what I'm going to do is when I take the small C-clips off, I can put them on the picture here so I know where they go back in those positions. So that should help a little bit in reassembling everything. Well, I actually identified the culprit in this mechanism, and that's this bearing right here. Appears to be the main bearing for this entire assembly. There's a small one here, but that was free. It's not doesn't seem to be a problem. There's just a guide rail here that was not bound up. This is the main pivot point right here. Now this bearing, I cannot seem to get this assembly off of this bearing post for some reason. That, of course, being that it is bound up. So what I've done is I've got some penetrating oil I'm using. And what we'll do is we'll take and soak that bearing, see if I can get some oil down into the top of that bearing, and see if I can loosen that up. And of course I've got my little hand-drawn diagram of the assembly, and I placed the little C-clips on the drawing where they came off, so I know which C-clip goes back on which post. Well, after many hours of soaking with penetrating oil, I've finally got this bearing to release. This bearing was so locked up you couldn't even move it. And once the penetrating oil got in there, and it took probably 2 days of soaking it with penetrating oil, I was finally able to get this bearing to release. And of course this is the mechanism that activates the pinch roller, which is kind of a complex mechanism. It pushes the pinch roller up and then toward the capstan. And of course it's spring-loaded, so it retracts again. But this was the main problem, this bearing right here. So I've got it cleaned up, and we're going to re-lubricate it now. And now that we have this bearing released, we should be in pretty good shape mechanically. Okay, looking at it from a slightly different angle now, I have to take a look. This was that bearing that was bound up. Now I've re-lubricated it, reinstalled the captive C-clips, and now that everything's been lubricated, it's fully operational again, mechanically. And that's how it's supposed to work. Well, with the mechanism completely restored, relubed, mechanically everything is operational. We checked the audio, and the audio is working fine as well. And we're back to the point where everything is put back together, reassembled. We can go into the testing phase. All of the mechanics are now reassembled. All the pivot points and bearings have been relubricated. And it still amazes me whenever I do these reconditionings how complex the mechanical mechanisms are. I can't imagine what it took back in the day to manufacture this equipment on a mass scale. The mechanics are just amazing. What it took to design these this equipment. Most of these older tape recorders are basically, they're more mechanical than they are electrical. Electronics is composed primarily of just an audio amplifier, 6 to 8 transistor audio amplifier driving a simple record head on record, and of course in reverse it plays, switch it around, it picks up the playback head and drives a speaker. So electronically they're very simple. Worst case is maybe a few coupling caps or electrolytics have to be replaced, but they're really simple. There's really not a whole lot to them. They're all mechanical. These things are, it's just amazing what it takes to, must have taken to put this stuff together back in the day. Okay, well, that was a little excerpt of music. Of course, there's no direct connection from the deck to the... That's off the tape now, too. Computer playing the MP3. Strictly a microphone held up to the computer speaker. So, not the best, I guess, but... It's my voice on the tape. Gives enough indication of what's going on. The TC-105 has a curious design issue. Well, not an issue really, but kind of the way the system works. Rather curious. When you first power up the system, the motor starts turning, as you can see here. One of the drive wheels is also turning, but it does not engage the flywheel, which I find rather curious. The only time the flywheel is engaged is when you're either in play or record. And what this is, the curious thing about that is that it takes, the flywheel is quite a hefty piece of metal, and of course it's riding on a nice bearing. But it takes a while to get that, takes a second or two for that flywheel to come up to speed. If you're playing a tape and you go into the play mode, or you're recording and you go into the record mode, it takes a second or two for that flywheel to come up to speed. And initially, things are slow until that flywheel comes up. But of course, once you go into the off mode, that the flywheel is spinning like crazy, and it'll spin for quite a while on that bearing. And of course, it comes up right away when you go back into the play or record mode, because that flywheel will be spinning for quite some time. It's not being driven by the motor, it's just spinning freely on its bearing. But if we slow it down and stop it, and then start over again, it takes a second for that flywheel to come up to speed. And a lot of the other recorders I've done, as soon as you power up the machine, the flywheel is always engaged. In some cases, the flywheel is actually part of the motor spindle and is always spinning. But not in this case, not in this machine. So that's the only thing I had to be aware of, is it takes a second for the flywheel to come up to speed, and the mechanism to come, the entire mechanism to come up to speed. I'm pretty sure this is a royalty-free music clip from YouTube, just for demonstration, of course.